Nobody goes into Morthvale and comes back the same, the old beta said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he gripped the wooden edge of the council table. Nobody except her. The silence that followed those words was the kind that pressed against the walls of a room and made even the bravest men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Alpha King Calum Dawnridge sat at the head of that table, with his jaw set like iron, and his silver eyes scanning the faces of every advisor, every general, every elder who had gathered to tell him what they knew about the growing darkness spreading through the borderlands. They had maps. They had reports. They had numbers detailing how many pack members had gone missing in the last 3 months, how many outlying settlements had been reduced to ash and silence, how many of his soldiers had returned from the forest's edge, hollow-eyed and shaking, unable to speak of what they had seen. What they did not have was a solution. And now, after 2 hours of deliberation and a great deal of very expensive posturing, the only answer anyone could offer him was the name of a woman no one seemed to think worth remembering. "Tell me about her," Calum said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. Every person in that room had spent enough time near him to understand that his quiet voice was far more dangerous than his raised one, and they all went very still at the sound of it. The old beta, whose name was Aldrich, and whose white hair and deep-lined face suggested he had lived through more political disasters than most people had years, cleared his throat and straightened in his chair. "Her name is Lyra Ashvale," he said. "She has been the guardian of Morthvale Forest since she was 16 years old. Her parents died in a border skirmish with the Eastern Rogues, and the then alpha of the Ashvale territory decided that rather than absorb 2 more mouths into the main pack, he would assign the girl to watch the forest." There was a pause that held a great deal of unspoken discomfort. "She has no wolf," Aldrich added, almost reluctantly. "Or if she does, it has never presented itself. She has no formal rank, no mate, no standing in any pack structure that we have documented." Calum absorbed this information with the stillness of deep water. "And yet she has survived 9 years in that forest," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty. And our soldiers who went to the border could not survive 3 days." Another silence. "Also, yes, Your Majesty." Calum pushed back from the table and stood, and the simple act of him rising made everyone else in the room straighten involuntarily, as if gravity itself acknowledged his authority. He was not the tallest man who had ever held the Alpha King title, though he was tall enough. He was not the heaviest or the broadest, though his frame carried the quiet density of a man who had been tested and had not broken. What set Calum Dawnridge apart from every alpha who had come before him was something harder to name, something that lived in the way he occupied space, in the particular quality of attention he gave to things, as if he were always listening for the thing beneath the thing being said. He had earned his title not through inheritance, but through challenge, and the 11 men who had tried to take it from him in the years since were either buried or serving in his eastern border garrison, where they had a great deal of time to reflect on their choices. "We leave for the border at dawn," he said. "I want to speak with her." The ride to the Ashvale borderlands took 2 days at a hard pace, and Calum spent most of it listening to his general, a broad and practical man named Roderick, explain all the reasons why consulting with a wolfless woman of no rank was beneath the dignity of the Alpha King and a waste of military resources. Calum listened with the patient expression he reserved for people who were wrong, but not wrong enough to correct immediately. And when Roderick had finished making his case, Calum said simply, "She knows things we do not. That makes her useful." Roderick said nothing further on the subject. The borderlands were colder than the capital, the sky above them a peculiar shade of pewter that seemed specific to this region, as if the weather itself knew it was at the edge of something strange. The Morthvale forest began where the regular tree line ended, and the distinction was immediately visible even to those who had never seen it before. The trees inside Morthvale were older, darker. Their bark had a texture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their canopy was so thick that even in midwinter, When all other forests stood bare, Morthvale kept its shadows. Standing at its edge, Calum felt the pulse of it against his own wolf senses. A deep resonance that was not threatening exactly, but was unmistakably alive in a way that most things were not. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She was waiting for them at the tree line. He had not expected that. His scouts had gone ahead to announce his arrival and to locate the guardian, and evidently she had decided to meet him at the border rather than bring him into the forest, which told him immediately that she was not impressed by his title. She was smaller than he had imagined. Not fragile, but compact, with the kind of economy of movement that suggested a person who had learned long ago that wasted energy was a luxury she could not afford. Her hair was dark and braided back from her face, in a way that was entirely practical and not at all decorative. Her clothing was the muted gray-brown of bark and earth, and she wore it with the unconscious ease of someone who had been wearing the same thing for years, because it worked, and she had never thought to question it. Her eyes, when they met his, were the color of forest shadow, something between green and gray and gold that shifted depending on the angle of the light, and they held a quality of attention that he recognized immediately because he had spent years cultivating that same quality in himself. She was reading him, thoroughly and without apology. "Alpha King," she said. Her voice was low and steady, and she did not bow. His general made a sharp sound of offense beside him. Calum raised one hand slightly, and Roderick went quiet. "You know who I am," Calum said. "Yes," she said, "and you know why I am here." She looked at him for a moment, then looked past him at the assembled soldiers and advisors, then back at him. "You need to understand what is moving through the forest," she said. "You cannot understand it from the outside, and your soldiers cannot survive it without a guide. Will you guide us?" She tilted her head slightly, and the movement was almost wolfish, which was interesting considering she apparently had no wolf. "That depends," she said, "on whether you are willing to follow instructions that will feel very counterintuitive to every alpha instinct you possess." Something shifted in the air between them. He could not have said what it was. "I am listening," he said. Her name, she told him as she led him alone into the forest, was Lyra, and she had been sent here as a child with nothing but the clothes on her back and a short knife that had belonged to her mother. The pack that discarded her had expected her to die within the first season. She had disappointed them in this, as in most things. The forest had not welcomed her immediately. Nothing about her early years here had been welcome. But she had approached Morthvale the way she approached everything, with careful observation and a willingness to be wrong about her assumptions. And gradually, over seasons and years, she had begun to understand the language the forest spoke. Not words, she explained, as they moved deeper between the dark trees and the shadows thickened around them. Not anything she could translate directly, but patterns, rhythms. The forest had a way of responding to intention, she said, and the dark things that had been growing within it were doing so because something in the forest's deeper architecture had been disturbed. Something old. Something that had been undisturbed for a very long time before something woke it. Calum walked beside her and said very little, because he was doing what he did best, which was listening beneath what was being said. He noticed that the trees seemed to shift as she moved, not dramatically, not in any way he could have cited as evidence to his counsel, but subtly, the way a crowd parts for someone it recognizes. He noticed that the shadows did not fall on her the same way they fell on him. He noticed that she moved through this place with a confidence that was not bravado, not performance, but the deep certainty of someone who had spent so long in a place that they had become part of its vocabulary. He noticed, with a sharpness that surprised him, and that his wolf noted with sudden intense attention, that she smelled like pine resin and cold water, and something older than either, something that resonated against the back of his chest, like a struck bell. He did not examine that observation immediately, He filed it. He continued walking. "The disturbance began about 14 months ago," she said, stopping before a particular tree whose roots were partially exposed and whose bark bore markings that looked like neither natural weathering nor deliberate carving, but something between the two. "I noticed changes in the behavior of the deeper shadow creatures, the ones that normally stay far inside the forest and feed on ambient energy. They began moving toward the edges. That is not typical." She traced one of the markings on the bark without touching it, her fingers following the shape of it in the air just above the surface. "It took me several months to trace the disturbance to its source. There is a place at the center of Morthvale, a clearing that is not on any map your people have made, because your people have never reached it. In that clearing there is a stone. Or there was a stone. Something has cracked it open." She paused. "I believe someone cracked it deliberately." The weight of that statement settled over Calum like a cold hand. "Who would do that?" he asked. "Someone who wanted what was inside," she said. "The stone was a seal, a very old one. Whatever it contained has been partially released, and it is feeding the shadow creatures, amplifying their hunger, driving them outward." She turned to look at him then, and the forest light, thin and strange as it was, caught in her eyes and made them look briefly luminous. "The creatures attacking your borderlands are not acting on instinct. They are being directed, and whoever cracked that seal can continue to crack it further unless we reseal it. But I cannot do that alone." Something in that admission cost her. He could see it in the slight tightening around her eyes, the fractional adjustment of her shoulders. She was not someone who asked for help easily. He wondered how many years of silence it had taken to hollow that skill out of her. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Someone who carries royal blood," she said. "The seal was made by the first Alpha Kings. It can only be resealed by one of their line." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of the forest breathing. "Then it is fortunate," Calum said, "that you have found yourself one." They returned to the camp at the forest's edge as the sun set and the borderland sky turned the deep bruised purple that preceded full dark. Calum's advisors converged on him immediately with concerns and objections, and a great deal of commentary on the advisability of following an unknown woman of no rank into a sealed supernatural forest alone, and he let them speak. Their concerns while he reviewed the intelligence she had given him, and found it more coherent and better evidenced than anything his council had produced in 2 months of meetings. Roderick, whose objections were the loudest, pointed out that they had no way to verify her claims about the seal, or the stone, or the clearing that appeared on no map. Calum agreed that this was true. He also pointed out that every other approach they had tried had produced no results, that the dark creature attacks were escalating, that 3 of his border packs had lost 1/3 of their members, and that a woman with no wolf and no resources had survived alone in that forest for 9 years, which suggested she understood it considerably better than they did. Roderick had no effective counter to this argument, and so expressed his disapproval through increasingly rigid posture for the rest of the evening. It was after the advisors had retired and the camp had settled into its nighttime rhythms that Calum noticed the second vehicle in the camp and the flag flying above the largest tent near the eastern edge. The flag was silver and black, the Voss family colors. His jaw tightened fractionally. He had not expected her here. He had not sent word of his destination to the Voss estate, which meant either that Lady Seraphine maintained a more effective intelligence network than he had credited, or that someone in his council had informed her. He suspected the latter, and he would be having a very specific conversation with a very specific advisor in the morning. Lady Seraphine Voss was already awake, and already, from the sounds emerging from her tent, conducting herself as if she owned the camp. He heard her voice giving instructions to what sounded like a full attendant staff, clear and sweet, and carrying the particular quality of authority that came not from rank, which she technically did not yet hold, but from the absolute certainty that rank was imminent. She was beautiful in the way that certain weapons are beautiful, with an elegance of construction that made you appreciate the craftsmanship before you remembered what it was built to do. She was 27, 3 years younger than him, and she had been presented to him by an arrangement between her father and his council that had been structured so carefully over so many years that he had occasionally wondered if he had ever actually agreed to it or if he had simply failed to disagree at the necessary moment. He respected her intelligence. He did not dislike her. He had simply, in 7 years of careful acquaintance, never once felt his wolf stir in her direction, and he had trained himself not to think about what that meant. She emerged from her tent as he approached, wearing traveling clothes that somehow managed to look like formal wear. Her dark hair arranged with the kind of precision that suggested either a great deal of natural talent or a very skilled attendant who had survived the journey at significant personal inconvenience. Her amber eyes found him and warmed in the particular way they always did when she chose warmth, which was to say that she selected it the way a person selects the appropriate tool, with accuracy and purpose. "Calum," she said, and her voice was the sound of silk over stone. "I heard you had arrived at the border." "Seraphine," he said, "I did not expect you." "I could not leave you to navigate this crisis alone," she said, and the smile that accompanied the words was gracious and practiced and contained, beneath its surface, the faintest edge of territorial assessment. "Besides," she added, "the council was concerned. It seemed useful for me to come." He noted the phrase, "the council was concerned," and filed it beside the question of who had informed her. "I appreciate the thought," he said, with the diplomatic precision of a man who had spent years learning to say things that were technically true. "We are making progress." Her eyes moved past him, toward the forest's edge, and he saw something move through them. Not fear, exactly. Something more calculated than fear. "I heard there is a guide," she said. "A local woman." "Yes," he said. "She has knowledge of the forest that we lack." "Of course," Seraphine said, and smiled again, and Calum recognized the specific quality of that smile because he had seen it deployed many times before, usually in the moments immediately preceding something strategically unpleasant for its target. "How helpful," she said. "What do you think will happen next?" Leave your predictions in the comments below. Lyra was aware of the beautiful woman the moment she arrived in camp, because Morthvale's edge had made her sensitive to shifts in the energy of a space the way a tuning fork is sensitive to sound frequencies, and the arrival of Lady Seraphine Voss sent a particular kind of ripple through the atmosphere that Lyra had learned to recognize over years of watching pack politics from the outside. It was the ripple of intention. Organized, directed, purposeful intention. She observed it with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything in the forest that was potentially dangerous, but whose threat level had not yet been confirmed. She did not, she told herself with practiced honesty, observe it with any personal investment. She did not think about the Alpha King's silver eyes, or the way he had moved through the forest beside her with a steadiness that suggested a wolf very much at ease with itself. She did not think about the moment, just once, when he had looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, but that had made something in her chest go briefly and unexpectedly quiet, like the forest after a storm. She was practical. She had survived by being practical. She packed her practical observations away and went to sleep in the small shelter she had built at the forest's edge, which was warm enough and weatherproof and entirely her own. She woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps she recognized. He moved differently from every other person in the camp, with a weight distribution that spoke of deliberate training and a natural center of gravity unusually low for his height. And she had already cataloged his footstep pattern the way she cataloged everything, because information was survival. She was sitting up when he reached her shelter's entrance, which she had not bothered to secure because nothing in the borderlands worried her, and she had found that secured entrances implied a vulnerability she did not want to advertise. "You wake early," he said. He did not appear surprised to find her alert. She suspected very few things surprised him. "You walk early," she said. He crouched at the entrance rather than standing over it, which she noted as a choice that was either instinctive or deliberate, and either way communicated a willingness to meet her at her level rather than above it. "I want to begin today," he said. "We need to reach the clearing before another creature wave hits the border." "How many days is the walk?" she calculated. "At a normal pace, 3. But we cannot go at a normal pace. The forest responds to urgency the way water responds to disruption. Move too fast and the shadows will stir." He absorbed this. 2 days then, she said. "Careful and quiet." He nodded once. "Just the 2 of us," he said. It was not quite a question. "Just the 2 of us," she confirmed. "Your soldiers would not survive the deeper sections. Not because they are not capable, but because the forest reads intention and pack energy the way a body reads infection. A group feels like an invasion. 2 people who are not fighting it feel like something else." "What do we feel like?" he asked. She looked at him in the early gray light. "I will tell you when we get there," she said. They left the camp before full sunrise, moving into the forest while the mist still hung between the dark trees in long horizontal threads that caught the light and diffused it until the whole interior of the forest glowed faintly. Not warmly, not with welcome, but with the particular luminosity of a thing that is simply, undeniably, alive. Lyra moved at the front, setting a pace that felt slow to her body, but that she knew was correct, measured against the forest's rhythm, the way a musician measures against a beat. Behind her, Kylam moved without complaint, without question, without the constant stream of commentary and status assertion that she had come to expect from every alpha she had ever encountered, which, admittedly, had not been many. He simply walked. He watched. He was present in a way that most people were not performing presence, but actually occupying it. And the forest, she noticed with a sensation that was part professional satisfaction and part something less easily named, responded to him differently than it responded to anyone else she had ever brought even to its edges. The shadows did not thicken when he passed. They leaned. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, but measurably to her trained observation. They leaned toward him as if curious, as if recognizing something. "The forest knows you," she said, after an hour of walking in a silence that was comfortable in the way that long-established silences are comfortable. Not empty, but full of the kind of understanding that does not require words. He considered this without dismissing it, which she appreciated. "I have never been here before," he said. "The forest does not care about before," she said. "It reads bloodline. Yours goes back to the first kings, the ones who made this place." A pause. "Or made the seal, at least. The forest itself was here before they were." He was quiet for a moment. "What was here before them?" he asked. She smiled slightly, which she was not certain she had done in some time and which surprised her with how easily it came. "That," she said, "is a much longer conversation." The morning deepened around them, and the forest settled into the particular rhythm of their passing, and Lyra found, with the part of her that was always monitoring and cataloging and assessing, that she was not currently doing any of those things. She was simply walking. She could not immediately determine whether this was a sign of trust or of dangerous inattention, and she filed the question for later examination. She had told herself over the years many things about herself and what she was and was not capable of. She had told herself that she was not lonely, which was largely true in the practical sense because loneliness requires an expectation of company, and she had stopped expecting that very young. She had told herself that she did not need the validation of a pack, which was also largely true because she had built her own system of validation from the forest's response to her and from the satisfaction of solving problems and surviving things that were supposed to be unsurvivable. She had told herself that she did not wonder what it would feel like to be seen by someone, genuinely seen, the way the forest saw her. That particular story she had told herself with less consistent success. There were nights when the forest was very quiet, and the wind moved through the upper branches with a sound like distant voices, and she lay in her shelter and felt the particular weight of 9 years of solitude pressing against her chest. Not unbearable. She had built a tolerance for it. But present. Always present. She did not think about this now. She focused on the path. By midday, they had reached the first threshold, a place in the forest where the energy shifted perceptibly, where the light changed quality from the ambient luminosity of the outer sections to something denser and more complex, layered with resonances that she could feel against her skin, like a change in air pressure. She stopped and held up one hand, and he stopped immediately behind her, which she noticed, without turning. "Here," she said. "The rules change. The forest is listening more carefully now. It will test you." "What kind of test?" he asked. "Different things for different people," she said. "It looks for what you are afraid of, for what you want most. It is not malicious. It is simply curious. But if you react to what it shows you, if you chase or flee, the path changes, and we lose our direction." She turned and looked at him then, which was something she had been somewhat consciously avoiding, because looking directly at him produced a quality of sensation that was distracting and inconvenient. His silver eyes were steady. "And what does it show you?" he asked. She held his gaze without flinching, because she had learned not to flinch. "Things I learned to stop reaching for," she said. "Walk close. Do not fall more than 3 paces behind me." What she did not tell him was that the forest had been showing her different things since he arrived at the borderlands. She did not tell him that since yesterday morning, when she had looked up from the tree line and seen him standing among his soldiers with that quality of stillness that she recognized from the deep places of Morthvale, the forest had begun showing her something she had never seen before in all her years as its guardian. She did not tell him that the shadows, which were normally curious about visitors, but essentially neutral in their response to her, had begun doing something she could only describe as leaning when he was near, oriented toward him with a recognition that made the ancient parts of her own awareness vibrate with something between alarm and a resonance so deep she had no name for it. She did not tell him any of these things because she did not yet know what they meant, and she had learned long ago not to speak about things she did not yet understand. She turned and kept walking. The threshold test began about 20 minutes after they crossed it. For him, she could not see what the forest was showing, because those visions were interior, felt rather than seen. But she could read the signs of it in the change in his breathing, the slight increase in tension across his shoulders that she noticed without meaning to, because she had been cataloging his physical state with the professional thoroughness she applied to all potential variables. She slowed her pace marginally and spoke without turning. "Whatever you are seeing," she said, "do not move toward it. Do not move away from it. Let it be there and keep walking." There was a pause. "It is showing me someone I could not protect," he said, and the quality of his voice had changed, not broken, but altered in a way that suggested the test had found something real. "Keep walking," she said, gently but clearly. "You are protecting them now. Every step toward the center of this forest is protection." Another pause. Then the tension across his shoulders eased by a fraction, and his breathing returned to its previous rhythm, and she felt something in her own chest ease in response, which she did not examine. For her, the forest showed what it had been showing since yesterday. It showed him, not threatening, not the vision of something lost, the vision of something possible. She kept walking, and did not reach for it, and did not run from it, and told herself she was managing this very professionally. By late afternoon, they reached the second threshold. And here she finally said something she had been holding for several hours. "Your wolf," she said. He was behind her and slightly to her left, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which was distracting. "What about it?" he said. "It has been responding to the forest since we crossed the first threshold," she said. "I can feel it." She could, in fact, feel it with a specificity that was becoming increasingly difficult to attribute to her guardian sensitivity alone. His wolf was old, much older in its resonance than his physical. Age suggested, carrying the weight of the bloodline behind it. Generations of alpha kings whose wolves had fed into one another across centuries, and it was not merely curious about the forest. It was resonating with it, resonating with something in the forest, or with something near the forest. She kept her face forward, and her voice professional, and kept walking. "Yes," he said simply. "It started yesterday. When you arrived at the tree line," she said. "Before," he said. "When I first heard your name." She stopped walking. She did not mean to stop walking. Her body stopped before her mind had processed the decision, and she stood very still in the shadowed forest, with the ancient trees around her, and the sound of her own heartbeat much louder than it should have been. And Calum Dawnridge stood behind her 3 paces back, close enough that she could feel the particular quality of attention he was giving to the back of her head. She made herself start walking again. She made herself breathe evenly. She was a guardian. She was practical. She had survived 9 years of things that killed most wolves in 9 days. She was not going to be undone by a sentence. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. That night they sheltered in a place she knew, a wide area between 2 particularly ancient trees whose roots had grown together over centuries to form a natural enclosure that was both windproof and, more importantly, was a space the forest treated as sacred. Nothing predatory entered here. The shadow creatures gave it a wide berth. She had slept here many times in the past 9 years, always alone, always with the silence of the forest pressing comfortably around her. And she built the small fire with the automatic efficiency of long practice, and was acutely, uncomfortably aware that the silence tonight felt very different from any silence she had experienced here before, because it was not entirely silence. It was filled with the sound of another person breathing. He sat on the opposite side of the small fire, and she sat on her side, and the fire was between them, and she was extremely grateful for the fire. "You have been alone here 9 years, he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "By choice?" She looked at the fire. "Initially by force," she said. "Eventually by choice, I suppose. The alternatives required returning to a pack that had made its feelings about me clear, and I found I preferred the forest's company." "The forest is not pack," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it does not require me to be something I am not in order to belong to it." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you?" he asked. The question carried no cruelty and no condescension, and was so genuinely curious in its construction that it caught her off guard in the same way the morning smile had caught her off guard, arriving from a direction she had not been guarding. "I am not certain," she said. "I am beginning to think the answer is more complicated than I was led to believe." She had been led to believe she was nothing. The alpha who had sent her here had said it plainly enough, that she was a burden, a wolfless child with no value to any pack, and that the most charitable use of her existence was to point it at the forest and see what happened. She had internalized this assessment with the thoroughness of a child who has no counter-narrative available, and she had spent 9 years in Morthvale building a new one from the only materials available, which were her own observations, her own conclusions, and the forest's increasingly clear response to her presence. But the forest's response had always been ambiguous enough that she could interpret it as purely environmental, purely the result of years of coexistence, rather than anything inherent to her nature. What had begun happening since yesterday was not ambiguous. The markings on the ancient trees, the ones she had assumed, were natural weathering for years, had begun to glow faintly in her presence. Not brightly, not dramatically, but measurably, undeniably, with a soft silver-green light that was the exact color of her eyes, and that had not been there yesterday morning. She had not told him this. She was not yet ready to examine it herself. The first Alpha Kings had mates, Caleb said, watching the fire. Not chosen. Found. The bond was always with someone who carried the forest's blood. She felt the quality of the air between them shift. She knew this history. She had read everything she could find about Morthvale in the first years of her tenure here. Every scrap of text that mentioned the forest. Every legend. Every pack chronicle that touched on the ancient times. She knew the history of the seal, and the kings who made it, and the mates who stood beside them, and the forest blood that had been diluted and distributed through generations until it was thought to be extinct. That bloodline was thought to have died out, she said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of how steady it was. Most things that are thought to have died out, he said, have simply not been correctly located. She looked up from the fire and found his eyes across it, silver in the firelight, and felt the resonance she had been refusing to name all day rise through her chest, like sound through water. His wolf was looking at her. She could feel it the way you feel the regard of something ancient. With your whole body, not just your eyes. And the part of her that had been waiting in the dark of her for 9 years, the part she had trained herself to ignore, looked back. She woke to movement at the fire, and was on her feet with her knife drawn before her eyes had fully focused, which was 9 years of guardian training operating below the level of conscious thought. What she saw when her eyes focused was not a threat. It was Caleb, sitting at the rebuilt fire with his forearms resting on his knees, and his gaze on the forest beyond the rude enclosure. And around the edges of the enclosure, the shadows were doing something she had never seen them do before. They were gathering. Not in the aggressive, compressed way of feeding or hunting, but in the attentive, clustering way of an audience. Thin threads of dark at the periphery of the firelight, and they were facing inward, facing him. They have been doing that for an hour, he said without turning. I did not want to wake you. She lowered the knife and breathed slowly and looked at the shadows and then at him. They are not threatening you, she said, though this was already obvious. No, he said. They seem, he paused, as if searching for a word, curious. They are reading your bloodline, she said. She crossed to where she had been sleeping and sat down, close enough to the fire to feel its warmth, which put her considerably closer to him than she had been the previous evening. They read mine the first season I was here, she said. Took them considerably longer to accept me. He turned then and looked at her, and in the firelight his face had a quality of careful openness that she was not accustomed to seeing on alphas, a willingness to be uncertain without being defensive about it. What did they find? He asked. Apparently, she said. Enough. The next day's walking was harder and quieter, as if both of them had said things the previous evening that required additional processing. The forest was different. Here, deeper in, with the ancient trees so large that 2 people holding hands could not have encircled their trunks and their roots, breaking the surface of the earth in patterns that Lyra had spent years learning to read. She navigated by these patterns now, by the way the roots oriented and the direction the bark markings faced, and the angle of the thin green light that fell through the canopy, following a path that was entirely invisible to anyone who had not spent years developing the ability to read it. Behind her, Caleb followed without complaint and without question, and with a steadiness that she found, against all practical intention, deeply comforting. The markings on the trees had been glowing since dawn. She was no longer pretending not to notice. Tell me something, he said, after a long silence. Anything. she said, because she was in the middle of navigating a particularly complex route pattern, and distraction was a risk she was accepting anyway, so she might as well accept it completely. When did you stop being afraid of the forest? She considered this carefully. I am not sure I ever stopped being afraid of it, she said. I think I stopped treating fear as a reason to go backward. Another silence. That is different from bravery, he said. Most things people call bravery are, she said. The clearing appeared before them in the late afternoon of the second day, and Lyra had seen it many times before, but she stopped short at its edge and felt the difference immediately. The last time she had visited, 3 months ago, the clearing had been still. The stone at its center had been whole, or whole enough, the crack in it a hairline she had catalogued with concern, but had attributed to age. Now the crack was finger-wide, and the energy leaking from it was visible, not to ordinary eyes, but to hers, in long trailing threads of deep violet black that moved through the air of the clearing like slow smoke. The stone was roughly the size and shape of a large altar, carved with markings that were older than the marks on the trees outside, and where it had been a dull gray, she remembered from her visits, it now pulsed with a dark light that was not quite light, a darkness that had been energized into something almost luminous. Standing at the clearing's edge, she felt the pull of it, the amplified hunger of the things it contained, and beside her she felt Calem's wolf respond to it with a surge of instinct that he controlled immediately, but that was unmistakable. There, she said unnecessarily. He stood very still. Yes, he said. I can feel it. Can you feel what cracked it? She asked. A pause. It was not accidental, he said slowly, reading the energetic signature of it with whatever alpha sense went beyond ordinary wolf instinct. Someone channeled power into it deliberately, to widen the crack. She watched his face as he processed this, watched the political implications arrange themselves behind his eyes. Someone who knew what was in it, he said. Someone who wanted it out. She nodded. Or wanted it directed, she said. At the border packs, at specific territories, at you. He turned to look at her. She met his eyes steadily. Someone with access to your council's intelligence, he said. Someone who knew you would eventually have to come here and might not survive. She did not say Seraphine Voss's name. She did not need to. She could see him thinking it. How do we reseal it? He asked. And she appreciated that he set aside the political question with the practical discipline of a man who understood the order of priorities in a crisis. I will show you, she said. But I need to tell you something first. She had been preparing this particular piece of honesty since the previous night's fire, since the moment she had felt his wolf's full attention and felt something in herself respond to it with a certainty that had no room for interpretation. What I am about to tell you may change. What you think of this situation, she said, or what you think of me. He waited. He was very good at waiting. The seal was made by the first alpha kings and their mates, she said. The bloodline required to reseal it is not just the alpha kings. It is the mated pair, both bloodlines together. She kept her voice level and professional. The forest blood and the royal blood fused through the bond. He was very still. The mate bond, he said. Yes, she said. I thought I had no wolf. She said, I thought I had no power. I thought I was nothing, which is what I was told, and what I had no reason to disbelieve. But the forest has been telling me something different for 9 years, and in the last 2 days it has been very specific. She held out her hand in the gray light of the clearing's edge, and the markings on the nearest tree cast their silver-green glow across her palm. And she let him see it. I am not powerless, she said. I carry the forest's blood. I carry the other half of this seal. The silence was so complete that she could hear the dark light moving in the clearing. And the bond, he said quietly. She looked at him. I felt it when you arrived, she said. At the tree line. 2 days ago. I felt it when I heard your name, he said. In the council room, days before I came. Something cracked open in her chest that was not the stone in the clearing, but felt similarly seismic. She had expected many things. She had not expected this. Calum, she said. And it was the first time she had used his name without his title. And his wolf came forward at the sound of it, with a focused attention that made the shadows at the clearing's edge surge and recede like a tide. I have been alone for 9 years, she said. I do not know how to do this. Neither do I, he said. I have been ruling for 11 years, and I do not know how to do this either. And somehow that was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in as long as she could remember, because she knew how to proceed with honesty, and she knew how to proceed with uncertainty, and she had learned that the combination of the two was generally sufficient. She took a breath. The resealing requires a claiming, she said. A formal mate bond, stated in the old tongue at the stone. The forest will recognize it and respond, and our combined bloodlines will allow us to close the crack. She looked at him steadily. I will not ask that of you, she said. I understand what it would mean politically. You have a betrothal arrangement. You have a council that has planned your future around that arrangement. I am a wolfless guardian with no pack, no title, no anything that would make this anything other than a political catastrophe for you. And I am entirely aware of that, and I want you to understand that I will find another way, or I will accept that the seal cannot be closed, before I would ask you to sacrifice your future for it. He looked at her for a long moment with those silver eyes that held nothing back when they chose not to. I am going to say something, he said, and I want you to listen to all of it before you respond. She nodded. I have spent 11 years ruling a kingdom, he said. I have made thousands of decisions about politics and strategy and alliance and duty, and I have made them well. And my kingdom is stable, and my borders were secure before someone deliberately destabilized them. I am good at my work. She waited. I have. Not, in 11 years, once felt my wolf recognize someone the way it recognized you, he said. I have not once, in 11 years, been in a space where I wanted to stop making strategic calculations and simply be present, simply exist in a moment, without managing it. I have not once entered a situation that felt, at some level beneath thought, correct. Until 2 days ago. She was very still. I am not asking you to save the kingdom, he said. I am telling you that the answer was already yes. Before you ask the question. In the clearing, with the dark light moving around the cracked stone and the ancient trees holding their silver-green light against the coming dark, Calum Donridge spoke the words of the claiming in the old tongue that he knew from childhood ritual and had never expected to use, and Lyra Ashvale, who had been told she was nothing, spoke the answering words in the same tongue that the forest had been whispering to her for 9 years in a language she had not known. She was learning, and the bond between them did not feel like a door closing, but like a door opening, like something that had been held shut by a great deal of sustained effort, finally being allowed to exhale. She felt her wolf for the first time, not as an absence filled, but as a presence always there now allowed to surface. And it was old, older than she was, older than 9 years of guardianship, carrying the weight of the forest itself in its bones, and it turned toward his wolf with the recognition of something finding what it had always been oriented toward. The light that came from her was not the soft ambient glow of the markings, but something brighter and stranger, silver green and deep gold woven together, and he was illuminated by it, and it by him. And together they placed their joined hands on the stone, and she felt the seal recognize them both, and she felt the crack understand, reluctantly, that it had been found and would now be closed. The sound it made was not loud. It was the sound of very old things resettling into their correct positions, a deep, subaudible resonance that she felt in her molars and the backs of her eyes and the center of her chest where the bond now lived with the warmth and steadiness of something permanent. The crack sealed from its base, slowly, visibly, the stone's surface knitting together with a light that came from within it and then faded as the seal returned to wholeness. The dark threads in the air of the clearing thinned and dissipated. The deep pulsing of the amplified shadow hunger at the forest's edges ceased, and she could feel it cease, the way you feel the cessation of a sound you had not consciously registered but had been bracing against. She breathed. He breathed. They stood in the healed clearing with the evening settling over the forest, and she was acutely aware that everything that happened next would be considerably more complicated than anything that had preceded it. And she found, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not afraid of complicated. They returned to the camp to find it in a state of carefully contained tension. The shadow creature attacks had ceased the moment the seal closed, which Roderick confirmed with the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important and is not yet ready to fully process it. The border pack reports that came in over the next hour were consistent. The creatures had retreated. The dark energy at the edges had dispersed. The missing. Soldiers who had been trapped beyond the borderline had begun emerging from the forest's outer edges, disoriented, but alive. There was relief in the camp, and there was confusion. And there was, Lyra observed with the detached precision she maintained in unfamiliar social situations, a very noticeable absence in the camp's center, where the Voss tent had been. The silver and black flag was down. She found this interesting. She filed it carefully. Calum called his council together within an hour of their return, before he had eaten or rested, because he understood, as she was learning he understood most things, the value of timing. He sat at the camp table and his advisors gathered around him, and she stood slightly back at the edge of the firelight, because she did not yet know what her place was in a council meeting, and she was not the kind of person to claim space she had not been granted. He looked at her at the periphery, and extended one hand toward the seat beside him, which was empty, which was the seat that, she noted from the placement, had not been empty at the previous night's meeting. She walked to that seat and sat down. No one at the table said anything, though several of them had expressions that suggested a great deal of internal commentary. "The seal is closed," Calum said. "The creature incursions are ended. We now have a second matter to address." He paused. "Lady Seraphine Voss has left the camp. She left approximately 3 hours ago, according to my guards, with a full departure of her staff. I believe this was not a coincidence." He looked around the table. "I want a full account of who in this room communicated my destination to the Voss estate." Another pause, considerably heavier than the first. "I also want a full account of any communication between members of this council and anyone who might have had both knowledge of the Morthvale seal and the means to crack it." The silence that followed was of the variety that contains confessions trying to decide whether to emerge. Calum waited with extraordinary patience and steady silver eyes until 3 of the 7 people at the table began speaking more or less simultaneously. The investigation that followed occupied several days that Lyra spent partly at the camp and partly moving between the camp and the forest's edge, checking the seal's stability and monitoring the shadow creature's retreat with the thoroughness of a guardian who had not had anyone to report her. Findings to for 9 years, and was finding with some surprise that having someone to report to was not unpleasant. The council's investigation produced names and communications and a paper trail that would have impressed her if she had not spent years observing the forest's ability to construct complex systems from simple principles. Seraphine Voss had not cracked the seal herself. She had hired someone who could, and had done so 18 months ago, when the political arrangement between the Voss family and the Alpha King's Council had begun showing signs of the particular strain that occurs when a party to an arrangement suspects that the other party's interest may be declining. The intent had been to manufacture a crisis that would require Caleb's personal attention, remove him from the capital, and ideally eliminate any possibility of a wildcard variable, which in the Voss intelligence reports was referred to only as the Guardian, appearing in his path. The seal cracking had been intended to kill the Guardian, not open a door to her. Lyra found this deeply ironic, in the way that most things trying to eliminate her had historically produced the opposite result. Seraphine Voss was apprehended at the eastern border of her family's territory, and the legal proceedings that followed were conducted with the measured efficiency that characterized everything in Caleb's kingdom when it was functioning correctly. The Voss family's political standing did not survive the process. Lyra was not involved in any of this. She had no standing in pack politics, and no desire for involvement in the mechanics of consequence. She monitored the forest, and she met with Caleb in the evenings when the day's work of crisis management allowed him time, which was not as often as either of them would have preferred, but considerably more often than she had shared evenings with anyone in 9 years. And she found that the adjustment from solitude to intermittent company was less difficult than she had expected. This was partly because he was easy to be near, in the way that the forest was easy to be near. Not demanding, not performing, simply present. And partly because the bond between them had changed the quality of solitude, even when they were apart, had placed something warm and steady in the space where the weight of isolation had been, something that felt very specifically like not being alone, even when she was technically alone. He came to her on the 7th day, with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not uncertain about it, but is uncertain about the delivery. She watched him arrive at the forest's edge where she was sitting in the gray morning light, and catalogued his expression with her standard professional thoroughness, and then abandoned the professional assessment and simply looked at him, which was something she was still learning to permit herself. "I have to return to the capital," he said. She had known this was coming. "Yes," she said. "I need to address the council's reorganization and the legal proceedings and approximately 300 other things that have accumulated in my absence." He sat down beside her, not across from her, as he might have done a week ago, but beside her, which she noted as a change, with a warmth that was becoming familiar. "I am asking you to come with me," he said. She looked at the forest. "The seal needs monitoring," she said. "We can establish a proper guardian rotation," he said. "Trained individuals who understand what they are doing, under your guidance. You have been alone here for 9 years, maintaining something that should have had a full team. That ends now." She was quiet for a moment. "I have never been inside a capital city," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I thought you might find it interesting." "I thought you might find me somewhat out of place," she said carefully. He looked at her with those steady silver eyes. "You were out of place here," he said. "And you made this forest yours. I do not think place is something that limits you particularly." She looked at her hands. The forest blood was still visible in the faint silver-green luminosity of the markings that had emerged on her skin in the days since the claiming, fine-lined and ancient, rising to the surface of her as if they had always been there waiting. Which, she was increasingly understanding, they had been. "I do not know how to be whatever it is you need me to be," she said. "In a capital, at a court, with a council." "I know," he said. "I do not need you to be anything you are not. I need you exactly as you are, which is someone who understands things I do not understand, and who says what is true even when it is inconvenient, and who survived 9 years of something unsurvivable without losing the capacity for honesty. I have been surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear for 11 years. He paused. "The forest chose you," he said. "It also chose us. I trust those choices." She sat with this for a long moment, in the way she sat with everything that mattered, fully and without rushing toward conclusion. Then she looked at him. "I will need to explain the forest's monitoring protocols to whoever you assign here," she said. "That will take at least 2 weeks." He smiled then, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him. And it changed his face completely, not into something unfamiliar, but into something that had been there, all along, waiting for the right condition to emerge. "Then we have 2 weeks," he said. The day she left Morthvale, the forest said goodbye in its language, which was not words. The light in the canopy shifted to the particular silver green she had come to associate with its acknowledgement of her, and the ancient route she had navigated for 9 years seemed to ease slightly, to settle, as if something they had been holding in tension had been resolved. She stood at the tree line for a long moment with her hand on the bark of the oldest tree she knew, the one whose roots and another's had grown together over centuries, and she felt the bond between them hum quietly in her chest, a warmth that had its own frequency now, that she could locate precisely in the space between her ribs. "I will come back," she told the forest. It rustled, which she had learned to read as understanding. She turned and walked to where Caleb was waiting with his horse and his soldiers, and a great deal of organized preparation for a journey she had never made before, and the part of her that was still the 16-year-old girl who had been left at these trees with nothing, and a short knife observed all of this with a quality of wonder she did not try to manage or contain. She had survived. She had done considerably more than survive. She had become what the forest needed, and what the seal required, and what, it turned out, the Alpha King had been waiting to find, without knowing he was waiting. And none of this was what she would have predicted 9 years ago, or 6 months ago, or even 2 weeks ago. She found this deeply encouraging regarding the general reliability of predictions. The capital city was everything she had not known to expect, and several things she had specifically not anticipated, including the volume, the smell, the density of pack energy moving through its streets, in currents she could feel against her guardian senses like weather systems, and the very specific quality of attention that accompanied her wherever she walked beside Caleb, which was the attention of thousands of people trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had expected to see. The council's announcement of the mate bond had been made before their arrival, along with the full disclosure of the Voss family's involvement in the border crisis, and the city was still processing the combination of these 2 pieces of information when they arrived, which meant that the population they rode through was somewhere between astonished and something that was tipping, she observed with detached professional interest, toward approval. There was something about the full account of the seal and the forest, and the wolfless guardian who had kept Morthvale contained for 9 years alone that appeared to resonate with people in a way that political arrangements could not manufacture. She had not anticipated that her story would belong to anyone other than herself. She was finding that this, too, required adjustment. She was, by now, accustomed to making adjustments. The formal ceremony was held 3 weeks after their return, in the great hall of the capital's oldest building, a place so thoroughly saturated with the energy of centuries of pack history that Lyra felt it against her skin like standing in deep water, present and encompassing, and very, very old. She had requested, and received without argument, the simple clothing over the elaborate choices offered to her, because she was what she was, and she had spent 9 years learning that simplicity was not a lack of something, but a quality in itself, and she wore it with the particular ease of someone who is not performing anything. The markings that had emerged on her skin since the claiming were visible at her wrists and throat and temples, silver green in the hall's light, ancient and luminous and entirely her own. She had stopped trying to cover them. They were part of what she was. The hall was full of people she did not know, who carried pack energy and political history and all the complexity of a social world she had not participated in for most of her adult life, and she stood in it and let it be there around her without trying to manage it or translate it into threat assessment, which was the work of 9 years of practice applied to a situation her 9 years had not prepared her for. She breathed. She kept walking. She found at the end of the aisle of formal witnesses an ancient protocol, the specific silver eyes that had become, in 3 weeks, the thing her internal compass oriented toward the way the forest's roots orient toward water. He looked at her the way the forest looked at the first light after a storm, with the open attention of something that has been waiting without certainty of outcome, and is now entirely certain. She stood beside him, and the ceremony proceeded with all the weight of its ancient words and its centuries of precedent, and she spoke her part. Of it in the old tongue, with the fluency of someone who had been learning that language from its source for 9 years, without knowing that was what she was doing, and he spoke his with the authority of a man who means precisely what he says and says precisely what he means. And the bond between them deepened another register, settling into something that felt less like a beginning than like an arrival. When it was done and the formal witnesses had given their formal responses, and the hall had registered the completion with the collective exhale of a large number of people who had been uncertain about how this would go, he looked at her with a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that she had learned, in 3 weeks, to recognize as the precursor to the full smile, and she felt her own face do something she was still getting used to. The hall saw it. The hall responded to it in the way large groups of people respond to something genuinely unperformed, with a warmth that moved through the assembled witnesses like a wave, beginning at the front and spreading outward until it reached even the people near the doors who had the worst view and could not quite see the markings on her skin or the quality of the Alpha King's attention, but could feel, from their position at the edge of the room, that something real was occurring. Something real was occurring. She did not become unafraid of everything. She did not become unknowing of what she had endured, or unknowing of what it had cost, or unknowing of the shape of 9 years of solitude. She did not stop being the guardian of Morth Vale, which now had a team of trained wardens under her guidance, and a protocol she had written in the most precise detail of anything she had ever produced. Because if she was going to trust other people with the forest she had tended for 9 years, she was going to make certain they knew exactly what they were doing. She did not stop being the person who had been left at a tree line at 16 with a knife and told she was nothing. She was still that person. She was also the person who had made something from nothing, repeatedly, with the tools she had. She was also the person the forest had chosen. She was also the person standing in the capital of the largest werewolf kingdom in the known world, with the Alpha King's wolf's steady attention, and the bond warm and permanent in her chest, and the silver-green light of the forest blood rising through her skin in the morning light of a window she had never expected to look through. She was also, she was finding, the person who had always been this, carrying it without knowing, waiting in the forest while the forest waited with her, until the moment when Calum Dawnridge had heard her name in a council room days before he had seen her face, and his wolf had known, with the certainty of things that are older and wiser than the minds that contain them, what she was, and what she would be, and what they already were to each other. She was also, she was finding, not done. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?